Welcome, everyone. My name is Kerry Grady Vincent, Senior Manager of Scientific and Clinical Programs at Osteoporosis Canada, and I am a registered dietitian for the past 30 years. I will be your moderator for today's webinar, Dispelling Myths about Calcium and Bone Health. At Osteoporosis Canada, we educate Canadians about bone health, including healthcare professionals and their clients. Our Scientific Advisory Council, made up of 80 bone health specialists from across Canada, are currently updating our clinical practice guidelines using the GRADE approach, and will be including nutrition recommendations. These guidelines are set to be released in 2021. There has been a resurgence of myths about calcium and how to best obtain these bone-building nutrients for the benefit of bone health. This webinar, intended for healthcare providers, will feature an expert panel to discuss and dispel the most common myths in their field of expertise. Before we get to the webinar, please note that there will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation, and we will do our best to answer questions in the time allotted. You can submit questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It's my pleasure to introduce our expert panel. Jennifer Sygo is a registered dietitian and sports nutritionist with Cleveland Clinic Canada in Toronto. A graduate of McMaster University with a degree in biochemistry, Jennifer was awarded a Master of Science in Human Biology and Nutritional Sciences from the University of Guelph, where she specialized in nutrition, exercise, and metabolism. Over her 15-year career, Jennifer has provided nutrition support to elite and professional athletes in over 20 sports, and currently serves as team dietitian for Athletics Canada, Swimming Canada, Gymnastics Canada, and the 2019 NBA champion Toronto Raptors. Dr. Lianne Tile is a member of the Osteoporosis Canada's Scientific Advisory Council. Dr. Tile is a general internist working at UHN and Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. She is Assistant Professor of Medicine at the University of Toronto as well. She is the Medical Director of the UHN Osteoporosis Clinic. She is a co-investigator with several clinical trials about osteoporosis and metabolic bone disease. Dr. Hassan Vatanparast is a professor of nutritional epidemiology with a joint appointment in the College of Pharmacy and Nutrition and the School of Public Health at the University of Saskatchewan. He investigates the impact of nutrition, food security, and other lifestyle factors on chronic conditions, particularly osteoporosis. Dr. Vatanparast also served in several advisory panels at national and international stages, such as our Scientific Advisory Council. This webinar is supported by an in-kind donation provided by the Dairy Farmers of Canada. Our first speaker is Dr. Lianne Tile. Lianne, please get us started.
Hi, thank you for attending today. As a physician who takes care of patients with osteoporosis, I find I'm often discussing issues of calcium with my patients. So as a background, it's important, and I know that you all realize this, adequate calcium is necessary for bone health. Osteoporosis Canada recommends 1,200 milligrams of calcium intake per day from diet and supplements, and dietary calcium is the preferred source. Based on a recent survey from the Canadian Osteoporosis Patient Network, 68% of respondents want the new osteoporosis guidelines, which will be out in 2021, to address nutrition, including dietary sources of calcium and calcium supplements. Commonly asked questions that I hear in the clinic include the following. How much calcium do I need? What is the best way to get calcium? What foods should I eat? And how much of those foods to get enough calcium through the diet? And what if I'm lactose intolerant? What if I'm vegan? And then many people wonder whether they need a calcium supplement. I also, when talking to my patients, hear a number of myths. These myths include the following. Non-dairy sources are as good as dairy sources of calcium. Calcium can cause heart disease and other health problems. And calcium supplements are as good as dietary calcium. Sometimes these myths result in people getting less calcium than they need for their bone health. So what are the impacts of low calcium intake? As mentioned, adequate calcium is necessary for optimal bone health. Low calcium intake is established as a risk factor for low bone mineral density. And importantly, adequate calcium intake is needed for safe and effective use of osteoporosis medications. In this webinar today, we are going to address the following myths about calcium and bone health. First, calcium requirements in Canada are too high and should be closer to 500 milligrams a day based on incorrect interpretation of the WHO recommendations. Second, the new Canadian Food Guide meets DRIs for calcium and vitamin D. Third, vegans need less calcium. And four, plant-based sources of calcium are highly bioavailable and can easily support calcium needs. We will also address the myths that countries that consume more milk products have higher incidence of osteoporosis, and that Asian countries have a lower incidence of osteoporosis.
Thank you, Lianne. That was great. Our next speaker is Dr. Vatanparast. He will begin by addressing the myth that calcium requirements in Canada are too high and should be closer to 500 milligrams a day based on incorrect interpretation of the WHO recommendations. Hassan?
Thank you, Kerry. Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending to this webinar. So this is one of the most common myths that I'm hearing and perhaps you are hearing. Before I enter to the myth, I like to kind of refresh our memory on what is happening in terms of our bone status throughout the lifespan. So as you see in this diagram, we have our calcium status, or sorry, bone mineral status is changing over time throughout the life. So here we have age, and here is bone mass on y-axis. So we have a very good window for building up our bones up to early adulthood when we reach to our peak bone mass. And then after that, as you see, there is a steady status up to around age 50. And then right after that, we see that there's a rapid decrease in bone mineral status around 8% per year for women, postmenopausal women. And then after age around 65, we see that there is almost similar patterns of bone loss in men and women, around 3% per year. So we have that perception that osteoporosis is a disease related to later in life, but in reality, what we see in this diagram, we have the opportunity to prevent that much earlier in life, so by achieving our peak bone mass. Now, what are the factors that are affecting our bone mass? Definitely genetics plays a very important role in here. So different studies have different numbers, between around 50 to 85% of our bone status is defined by our genetic. Then after that, it comes to environmental factor. So nutrition, physical activity, a good lifestyle allows us to achieve to that potential bone mass in early adulthood. This is what we need. And then if we choose to go to unhealthy lifestyle, then you see the difference in here, and such difference can continue. Imagine that I go with unhealthy lifestyle. What happens over time, I am already very much low. I didn't achieve to my potential genetically, say potential genetically designed bone mass. And then later in life, I'm gonna be losing, already I am at the lose, I'm losing much more. So I am much more at risk of osteoporosis. So again, another indication that what is happening in terms of osteoporosis is really not later in life. We need to start much earlier. Now moving forward, definitely you know that calcium is one of the most important nutrients that we need in our body, the most abundant nutrient. And for bone, again, the same story. How those recommendations for calcium are set up? You may be familiar that Government of Canada and United States have contracted the Institute of Medicine under National Academy of Science in the United States. They have a Food and Nutrition Board. They are responsible for coming up with recommendations for nutrient intake based on existing evidence. For each nutrient, they have a panel of experts. The most renowned scientists around the globe. They are sitting in that panel, and then they go through the literature, and then based on that, they come with evidence. For most age groups, they use calcium balance study, basically calcium in and out to see what is happening, what are our requirements. I'm going to share with you an example in here. This is from our own study, and this is what we did in here was considered line of evidence for studying the new DRI, dietary reference intake by Institute of Medicine in 2010. Imagine that each of us have some calcium needs and some calcium losses to urine, feces, and then sweat. And then there is absorption efficacy. Usually say on average it's 30%, but for adolescents, I put in here 38% because the absorption efficiency is higher. And then if we take all these factors into consideration, we can come up with what we need in terms of calcium requirement. In our study, pediatric bone marrow acquired study, we followed the same children from age 7. Now they are around 40. We followed them. Last measurement point was in 2019. And then we did say the DEXA, we have bone body composition, and then we were able to come up with milligram calcium that is accumulated in bone in each given day. So you see the average number of 175 milligram calcium, that's a daily accumulation in bone. And then we communicated with the researchers in different countries on getting access to their raw data on urinary, fecal, and then sweat loss of calcium. And then we came up with this value, 1,1300. What I'm presenting in here for you is really a summarized version of the information. Basically, between males and females is very much different, the requirements, and also before puberty and after puberty, we noticed that there is a difference. Now, this kind of line of evidence goes to the review by that panel, and they come up with what you see in here, dietary reference intake for calcium. What I mentioned from our studies considered as evidence in these lines. And then if you look at two age group 50 and over, you see that we have EAR value of 1,000, and this is recommended daily allowance. That's at individual recommendations, 1,200. Now, if you look at here in the blue table, you see that I put together what we know about recommendation in different countries. Seems that North American recommendation is a bit higher than the other countries, but we need to consider that there is a reason for that I'll go to it later on. And another note in here, perhaps it's good to know that calcium has a threshold behavior in a way that one might assume that the more I take calcium, the more I can absorb, but in reality, it's not the case. So in different age groups, we have different threshold levels. So at the highest threshold is 1,000, around 1,000, which is around adolescence. And then after that, you see that there is some kind of a plateau. So basically, whatever you take more than that is going to be excreted. So that's why we call it calcium has a threshold behavior. Now, those who have gone through WHO recommendations, they may have seen these two tables. The first one is the recommendation that they considered as recommendation. And then they said that, well, it's set up based on North American and Western European countries. As you see, it's very much similar to what we have, what Osteoporosis Canada is recommending for postmenopausal women. And now, also, you will find another theoretical calcium requirement in a situation that animal protein is restricted, just to show that if we decrease animal protein, the recommendation for calcium is going to be lower. We had a study ourselves from pediatric bone marrow acquired study. We noticed that in a situation that calcium is adequate, protein intake really is beneficial for bone. So we blame protein for negative effect, but in reality, there is a good balance between calcium protein that I believe is going to be gone through later in this presentation. So now, taking this hypothetical kind of scenario, you see that the recommendation is going much lower. So those who believe that WHO recommendations are saying that's much lower, it's a hypothetical table, not this table that they considered as the main recommendation. Now, what is happening in reality? You may be familiar with what we call as Eat Lancet Commission. That's the planetary health diet. Interestingly, what they suggest as recommendation for data intake is very much similar to what we have in New Food Guide in Canada. On your right side, you see that, say, imagine that kind of orange circle in here shows what we need to have in our plate. Comes to beef, meat as source of protein, what we get is 638% higher than what we really need. And then you see in other cases the same story. We are getting too much. Going to South Asian countries, for those who are comparing Canada, say, for Southeast Asia, saying that, oh, their recommendation is much lower and our recommendations are, and then they have lower fracture, you see that really what they eat in terms of meat is much lower than what we have, very much lower. So that would be one of the factors that can be considered in that regional differences. So moving forward, so anyways, we have that concern about too high of recommendation. Some of us have that. I don't have it, basically. But in reality, what is happening in Canadian population? If you go to your top left diagram in here, you see prevalence of inadequacy in calcium intake among Canadians in 2004 and 2015, among those who are not using any source of calcium supplement. You see that I'm going to be focusing on postmenopausal women here. You see that the prevalence of inadequacy is very high, is around 90% in 2015. One other thing that you need to consider is that between 2004 and 2005, there has been very much increase in prevalence of inadequacy. It means that people are not getting enough calcium in 2015 compared to 2004. Now, for those who have calcium in their diet, you see how the prevalence of inadequacy decreases, which is very interesting. And but it still is very high, it's around 60% at age 70 and over, and then around, say, 40-something% in at age 50 and over. Now, if you go to your diagrams on the left, I'm going to be focusing only those who have osteoporosis. What's their prevalence of inadequacy in calcium intake among them? For those who are not using any source of dietary supplement for calcium, the prevalence of inadequacy in 2015 is very high, is 90%. For those who are taking supplement, is between 40 and 50, around 43%. There is a huge decrease in prevalence of inadequacy. But if you compare 2004 and 2015, you see that those with inadequate intake of calcium increased significantly. And then there is a reason for it. Between around 2009 was the first study that we had on the concerns about risk of calcium for calcium supplementation for cardiovascular disease. Now, so what is the take-home message? There is a thorough scientific process for determining nutrient requirements through National Academy of Science. The WHO recommendation is based on North American and European recommendation. The lower hypothetical recommendation is estimated according to a situation where the intake of animal protein is really low. Calcium intake is affected by other nutrients as well as many other factors that it justifies the region-specific recommendation for calcium. And many Canadians, particularly those who are older adults, they are not meeting the current requirements, and also those who are suffering from osteoporosis. So, and also between 2004 and 2015, there is a decreasing trend in calcium use, both from food and supplement.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vatanparast. That was great. The next myths will be presented by Jennifer Sygo. Jennifer?
Hello, everyone. So the myths that I've been asked to speak to today are, to start off with, whether or not the new Canadian Food Guide meets the DRIs for calcium and vitamin D. Many of us may recall that the new Canada's Food Guide, and in particular the snapshot that we see here, was introduced in Canada in June of 2019. And it featured a number of changes versus previous versions of the food guide. In particular, when we are talking about the structure of the food guide, there's no longer an emphasis on food groups and servings. Instead, we see that there is a discussion around having plenty of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and protein foods, and that we are to choose protein foods from plants more often. You can also see that half of the plate is now made of vegetables and fruits, and that beans, nuts, and seeds are more prominent than in previous versions of the food guide. You'll notice on the right that water is now the drink of choice, whereas milk and fruit juice are not featured on the main snapshot. It's also recommended that we limit added sugars as well as alcohol and saturated fats. So the question then is this an adequate a diet that adequately meets our needs for both calcium and for vitamin D, as well as for other nutrients? So in 2019, Susan Barr from the University of British Columbia published a paper that examined these images in the new food guide snapshot and analyzed each item in the estimated portions that you see illustrated here, and then used the Canadian nutrient file to compare them with the percent daily value for each of these nutrients. From there, she determined the probability of inadequacy, if there was any, for each nutrient that was analyzed. So what did we see as results? Well, if we look here on the right, you can see the amount of each nutrient that's reflected in the snapshot, starting at the top with nutrients that we are told to limit. What you can see in general is that while many nutrients that we are looking to consume, which are the ones featured in the bottom of the image, exceed the percent daily value, and in some cases by several fold, for example, vitamin C and vitamin K, and all of the nutrients to limit, such as saturated fat and sugars, fall below the target amounts. Both calcium and vitamin D were identified as sources of potential deficiency. And in fact, the calcium amount reflected in the snapshot represents only 50% of the daily value, and vitamin D only 42% of the daily value. Now, remember that the image that I'm speaking to right now reflects a 2,000 calorie per day diet. In a moment, I'll talk about the breakdown amongst different ages and sexes. It is worth noting that potassium was slightly below the daily value as well. And I think that's possibly due to the fact that while there are a number of high potassium vegetables and fruits that are illustrated in the snapshot, the limitation in both meats and dairy foods, which do provide potassium, may be part of the reason why that didn't quite achieve 100% of the daily value. So as I mentioned, Susan Barr then broke down the risk of insufficiency by age and sex and adjusted the portions of each food item in the snapshot to reflect the estimated energy requirement of each age group. And so as you can see, the estimated calcium intakes using the snapshot divided by age and sex ranged from 481 milligrams per day in children 4 to 8 to 881 milligrams per day in teen males. In no case did any group obtain even 1,000 milligrams of calcium per day, much less 1,200 milligrams per day. And in fact, for children's, teens, men over 70, and women over 50, the probability of not meeting calcium needs was over 97%. And the probability of insufficiency never went below 85% in all females. It is worth noting that women between the ages of 19 and 30 had the lowest probability of inadequacy, as their estimated average requirement for calcium is only 800 milligrams per day, and their energy needs are at the highest of any age group amongst the women, which basically means that they get to eat more food, which gives them a higher probability of meeting their needs. When it comes to vitamin D, the results were similar. The estimated probability of inadequacy ranged from 26% to 93%, depending on age and sex. Males between the ages of 14 and 30 had the highest chance of consuming inadequate vitamin D if they followed the snapshot, largely due to their high energy needs. It is worth noting that the estimated average requirement for vitamin D is specifically designed to speak to bone health and not other potential roles for vitamin D, such as immune function. So there's potentially other concerns related to this low vitamin D intake. So in conclusion, while following the new Canada's Food Guide snapshot would meet most nutrient needs for most Canadians, both calcium and vitamin D may be inadequate and could put Canadians at risk of deficiency. So let's take a little step then into another popular myth, which is that plant-based sources of calcium are highly bioavailable and can easily support calcium needs. And this will bring us after that to our discussion around vegan diets and calcium requirements. So in reality, many plant-based sources of calcium, while they may contain calcium, also contain other compounds that can affect the absorption or bioavailability of calcium. So specifically, compounds such as oxalates and phytates are often present in plant-based sources of calcium, and they may inhibit calcium absorption. Conversely, animal foods, such as the foods I've listed here, yogurt, cheese, milk, and meat products, have very little or no oxalate or phytate content, and therefore have very little in terms of compounds that inhibit calcium absorption. In this slide, we see both the calcium content and the oxalate content of a number of different foods that might be used in a plant-based diet or a diet that of an individual who's following a vegetarian or vegan diet. And as you can see, while there might be calcium available from these foods in terms of total calcium content, the oxalate content varies considerably and at times can be very high. If we look, for example, at spinach, which has one of the highest oxalate contents of any food. Now, while it is worth noting that a number of plant-based foods do have highly bioavailable calcium, for example, kale has very little oxalate, and therefore the calcium that it contains is going to be well absorbed. Many of those foods still contain relatively low amounts of total calcium. As you can see, none of these foods exceeds 100 milligrams of calcium per serving, whereas, for example, a serving of milk or yogurt would provide 300 milligrams of calcium. So this begs the question then, do vegans in fact need less calcium? So this is generated largely from the hypothesis that consumption of animal proteins increases renal acid load. And so essentially in that regard, if we are consuming a large amount of acid in our diet, specifically from animal proteins, that we must remove calcium from our bones to balance that calcium out, and that calcium is then excreted in the urine. And therefore, by consuming a lower protein diet, vegans may be able to reduce their renal acid load, which would spare calcium losses from bone and reduce calcium requirements. This is the theory or the hypothesis as to why vegans may have lower calcium requirements and may potentially have healthier bones. So what is the reality? In fact, when we look at studies that demonstrate increased urinary calcium losses associated with higher protein intake, it's worth noting that those studies typically use purified proteins. In other words, proteins that are not present in a whole food form or part of the whole food matrix. When we look at studies that use protein in real foods or foods that have a complex food matrix, in fact, this effect is largely reduced. It's also worth noting that dietary protein may promote bone growth, as we already heard, and an increase in calcium absorption from the intestine. Likewise, lower protein diets not only are associated with loss of muscle, specifically sarcopenia, which is age-related muscle loss, as well as loss of strength, which may affect balance and fall risk, but lower protein diets themselves may be associated with an increased risk of hip fracture. So in reality, renal acid load is not associated with indicators of bone mineral resorption and has not been linked to reduced bone density. And as we're going to find out now, vegan diets may in fact be associated with reduced bone mineral density versus vegetarian and omnivorous diets. So in this slide here, this is what is called a forest plot. So this is a forest plot taken from a systematic review and meta-analysis, which was published last year by Iguasel and colleagues. In this image, we see the comparison of lumbar spine bone mineral density, or BMD, from studies of both men and women following vegetarian and vegan diets versus a reference diet that contains meat. So in a forest plot, any result that's to the right of the zero line or the solid line indicates a positive change versus the reference diet. Any result to the left of the zero line indicates a negative or unfavorable change. So as we can see here, both the vegetarian diet, which is indicated by the blue diamond, and vegan diets indicated by the yellow diamond are associated with reduced lumbar spine BMD versus the reference omnivorous diet. And in fact, this effect was more pronounced in the subgroup of vegan diets. Similarly, in this slide here, we see the image of a forest plot of the bone mineral density of the femoral neck, looking at both studies that have examined vegetarian diets and vegan diets compared to meat-containing diets. And the results are very similar. So we see a reduction in BMD in the femoral neck from those consuming vegetarian diets, and an even more pronounced reduction in those consuming a vegan diet. It's also worth noting that the effects of a vegan diet on bone mineral density were more pronounced in Caucasian versus Asian women, and in women over 50 years of age than in those under 50. So this is something that certainly requires more investigation, but it suggests that in Caucasian women who are postmenopausal, a vegan diet may have a more harmful effect on bone mineral density than in women who are younger or of different ethnicities. It's also intriguing to note that the negative effect of a vegetarian or vegan diet on bone mineral density was more pronounced in higher quality studies than in lower quality studies. So lastly, what about fracture risk? So right now, until now, we've been speaking about bone mineral density, but at the end of the day, we want to speak about actual outcomes. So what about fracture risk from following a vegan diet? Well, interestingly, a study just came out this week, which was one of the first studies that looked at fracture risk in individuals following a meat-containing diet versus a vegetarian diet, vegan diet, or pescatarian diet, which is a vegetarian diet that also includes fish. This was a prospective cohort study, and dietary information was collected at baseline between the years of 1993 and 2001, and again at follow-up around the year 2010. And so in this study, we see total hip and leg fracture by diet type after the average 17.6 years of follow-up. So again, in this study, individuals identified themselves as following one of the 4 diets listed here. And then after an average of 17.6 years, they were asked about their fracture history. And so you can see here a very pronounced effect where those who followed a vegan diet over the course of this study saw an increased risk of fracture, both in terms of total fractures in the top image, as well as site-specific fractures in the bottom 2 images. Now, I have highlighted both hip fractures and leg fractures here, but in this study, which is available for download, you will see up 7 total fracture sites that were included. I've just selected 2 here. And so you can see here that there's quite a pronounced effect of consuming a vegan diet in particular on fracture risk. And interestingly, this seemed to be related to partly body mass index changes in those who followed a vegan diet. In other words, they tended to be lighter and therefore potentially increase their risk of fracture due to low body weight, but also partly due to inadequate calcium and inadequate protein intake. So in conclusion, Osteoporosis Canada guidelines for calcium and vitamin D remain the same regardless of diet type. So because one consumes a plant-based or vegan diet, it doesn't mean that they require less calcium. It simply means that we have to become more creative and more aware about how to ensure people who follow a plant-based diet can meet their calcium needs. And so vegans should be aware of the potential for increased risk of reduced BMD and potentially fracture risk related to their dietary habits, and therefore their dietary habits should be adjusted accordingly to meet the needs, particularly of calcium and vitamin D.
Thank you, Jen. That was great. Now for the last myths, we will be going back to Dr. Vatanparast. So Hassan, if you can take it away.
About this myth, this has been around for a long time. It's not something new. So where this come from? Let me start with very basic epidemiology kind of background. Those who have been in the field of epidemiology, they know that study designs are different from study to study. And based on that, the level of evidence is totally different. So for example, in left side, the weakest studies are in here, like case reports. In rare cases, usually comes from clinical population. And then we have case studies, cross-sectional studies, and ecological studies. What are ecological studies? In a very simple language is that we are making correlation between one entity and another entity. In this specific case, say North European countries, say like Sweden or Finland, they have high intake of milk. And oh, look at their prevalence of osteoporosis is very high. So then there is a correlation between them. Now, if you look at the level of evidence is one of the weakest evidence that we have. And from a biostatistical perspective, when you are dealing with two panels of data, even from concept perspective, they are irrelevant. You may find some correlation. For example, you can find correlation between number of ships that are passing Atlantic Ocean and number of cancer cases in China. So most studies that we had when this myth came was those kind of correlation studies. On the other side of the story, we have randomized trials, systematic reviews, and cohort studies. So those with the strongest level of evidence are randomized trials. So in the field of epidemiology, nutritional epidemiology, it's really hard to run randomized trial. Why? Because randomized trials, we cannot control for people's diet. We cannot control for everything. So that's why we mainly rely on cohort studies that have a very well designed kind of procedure in data measurements and so on. Then in systematic reviews, if we look at the other side of the study, story, milk and risk of fracture, I having at the top of my mind for most recent ones from 2018 to 2020, start with no association to say up to 200 gram per day, there is a protective effect on fracture. And after that is not clear, not that it has kind of negative impact, it's not clear. And the most recent one that we have in 2020 is reassuring that it has protective effect. Now, with this background, let's move forward. So we talked about ecological studies. This is, you see these maps in here. On the left top, you see per capita or per person per year milk consumption across the globe. The darker the color, you see that the higher intake. And then this myth came from the observation in here. Now, so I can tell you, I can give you an example in here. It's the per capita milk intake per year is around 355 kilogram per year in here. And then we have another country in here, Iran, because I have the data from that country I can share with you, is around 66 kilogram per year. But if you look at prevalence of hip fracture, on the map below, you see that the prevalence is very much similar. And why is that? So Sweden is very well known, and also Finland very well known for their health information system that captures every health-related events. And Iran, from 2000, they started national osteoporosis prevention incorporated in healthcare system in a way that they have active diagnosis procedure in everywhere, and they are collecting data on it, and they have preventive strategies on that. So one of the challenges is that we really don't have data in many places. So here, very low intake of milk, high prevalence of osteoporosis. Here, high intake of milk, high prevalence of osteoporosis. And then look at the geography as well. This is another factor. And on the figure on the left side, right side at the top, this is corresponding kind of calcium intake around the globe. Again, it's per capita. You see that is almost following the same pattern as we have in milk intake, showing that milk is really one of the major sources of calcium. And here on the right corner, you see kind of a map of distribution of osteoporosis in different countries. The ones that are kind of pinned as red, those that they have higher prevalence of osteoporosis. And again, it's scattered everywhere. And it really comes to a data registry system that they have, a health information system, how good it is to capture the events. Now, moving forward. So this, as I mentioned, this paradox of calcium intake has been run is a very simplistic approach to just consider calcium intake from milk, because and the main reason is that really in developing countries we do not have enough data to see what is happening in terms of other factors that may have impact. So it's too simplistic to consider just calcium. There are much more factors play a role in here, like nutritional factors, protein, sodium, potassium, caffeine. I saw one of the questions about caffeine in question and answer box. Soft drink intake, alcohol, vitamin D, etc. And again, genetics play a very important role in here. Ethnicity, the type of bone quality that we have, which is different from person to person. And say there is a racial difference between in bone quality as well. And calcium metabolism, again, is different. Geography, risk of fall is higher in countries that they have longer winter. Culture and diet. I put example of Guatemala in one of my studies that is going on right now in Guatemala in high mountainous area. The original perception that I had was that okay, they should have low calcium. They are very short. The prevalence of malnutrition is very high. Food insecurity is very high. And then I looked at the type of food that they have, and then the perception was that the main staple food, which is tortilla for them, is really cannot be considered as a source of calcium. But and milk is a luxury food there. So then we went to the food composition data. The preparation of tortilla adds lots of calcium in it. It was a surprising thing for me to know personally. And then comes to lifestyle factors like physical activity, smoking, and medication use, type of medication that people have. That's a good thing that now we see more shift toward looking into race and diet interaction in acquisition, maintenance, and bone loss. There are papers are coming. So what are the sources of bias when it comes to studies linking milk with fracture? So there is a reverse causality. So imagine that I have osteoporosis and I drink more milk. I already have it. I'm changing my diet because I am already sick. So we call it reverse causality. We have seen that in Canadians. We have published papers on that. Say when it comes to diabetes, we have seen the same story. Those who have diabetes, they have healthier diet compared to those who don't have, which really doesn't make sense. But really, it's a matter of reverse causality. Recall bias. So usually most studies in older adults, they look into the childhood, kind of, we call it milk frequency intake questionnaire, that kind of milk history questionnaire. The fact is that you don't remember. And then this is a very raw estimation what you had, and then you cannot really rely on it. The other thing that is really interesting is that those who have fracture, they more likely to remember foods that have protective effect on fracture. So again, that's the recall bias. Then this anti-milk lobby that brought this, basically they simplify the problem. And what we see in the Scandinavian countries, most recent papers, there have been 2 papers that they brought genetic factors as most important factors related to those countries when they have, where they have high prevalence of osteoporosis. I like to share with you, this is from one of our studies, what is the trend in milk intake as a source of calcium in Canada? Again, you see the diagrams for those who are not using calcium supplement and those who are using calcium supplement. And we see here 2015, orange, and blue 2004. It's very interesting to see, and perhaps worrisome to see, that milk consumption has decreased in 2015 significantly as a source of calcium compared to 2004. And there are other sources that we see that they are increasing. When it comes to supplement users, we almost see the similar pattern. Moving forward, we have some gap in our knowledge when we are trying to link milk and osteoporosis. So we need to recognize that we really need to know more about calcium balance in different countries, considering the role of genetics and racial differences in calcium metabolism. We need to know the role of culture, geography, genetics related to bone quality, interaction between nutrition, race, and bone. And then we need to have kind of a more validated approach in calculating calcium requirements based on the region, considering all local factors that may have impact on calcium. And we need to say the impact of latitude, sun exposure. There are some questions in question box related to vitamin D, the interaction between vitamin D and calcium absorption and bone health and so on. So now to summarize as a take-home message in this part, I like to say that, yes, it's very simplistic to see just to link just milk with fracture. There are many other factors. The recent studies that we have, they have lots of limitations. And then milk and alternatives are the main source of data intake for calcium. And then imagine if we remove it, what would be the replacement? We can talk about it further. In addition, milk really provides much more nutrients, around 12 nutrients, and most of them are bone beneficial. So it's not easy to kind of put aside nutrients. And we have seen in our simulation studies that removing milk really causes problem in terms of cost effectiveness and from public health perspectives. And also there are many gaps in our knowledge. And again, bringing to the notion that genetics are different. And then we need to have more studies to see what is happening in different countries. With that, I'd like to move to the next myth. So Asian countries have a lower incidence of osteoporosis. I like to, again, go back to the map of osteoporosis fracture, hip fracture that I showed you. Again, the red colors show that there's a significantly high number of hip fracture. And then when you go to the gray areas, we don't have that much data. And then green ones, the incidence is low. If you go to the literature, you see that there are different justifications. So basically, Asian women have lower bone mass compared to Caucasian women. But the hip fracture is low. Why this is happening? Theoretically, previous studies have shown that there is a shorter hip axis length that it helps preventing fracture, hip fracture. And when we are talking about osteoporosis, previous physical activity might be higher in women in China, in Asian countries. And the cultural practice of taking care of elderly, we know that it's really, so there is a cultural difference in how to treat elderly. And they are respecting a lot and they are taking care of them. Any movement is taken care of, and then the risk of fall is much less in them compared to other cultures. I'm going to go back to this slide. And then also sun exposure, protein diet, skin color, height, weight, and everything, there is difference, and there is a different genetic difference. So looking at the DIGS there have been studies in countries like United States comparing Asians with Americans. So Asian Americans basically have the lowest BMD, bone mineral density, compared to African American and Caucasians. Basically, they have the lowest. Then now there are advanced technology like HRPQCT that is used for imaging, give us much better perspective what is happening in bone of the people. Then basically what they suggest is that the trabecular sites, like say in vertebrae, there is much higher risk of fracture. Bone loss is happening much more in there or in distal radius compared to cortical bones. And in Asians, they have thicker bones and then denser cortex. And then there is definitely a racial difference in regulation of mineral metabolism that we need to take to account. This is a very recent study, these two, from two different states that I'd like to share with you. So here, this is Chinese adult in males. You see the cortical bone, the cortex is much more thicker compared to Caucasian male. We don't know if the same kind of ratio is kept up to the adulthood. And here, again, this is in women. We see the thickness. And also when it comes to trabecular bone, we have a kind of plate-form trabecular bone that's much higher in Asian women compared to more kind of a rod-shaped trabecular bone in Caucasian. So there is really a difference between them. So what is happening in reality? If you look at the most recent literature, they said that, well, we need to wait. The greatest burden of fracture comes from Asia, especially from China. And osteoporosis was really underdiagnosed so far and undertreated. Even for those who have fracture, the diagnosis of osteoporosis has not been done in them. So this is really important to know. And vertebral fractures are very common. So if you look at to literature or even in Hollywood movies that are, or other movies in that region, you see that bended kind of back, which is really a good indication of chronic vertebral fracture is seen much more in Asians. And then there are some sporadic studies in Beijing and other countries showing that there is a high prevalence of such kind of fracture in them. Now, the take-home message in here, earlier studies suggest low hip fracture risk among Asians, justified by genetic difference in bone structure, lifestyle, culture, and diet. Recent studies, they are talking about a more kind of detectable difference in thickness of cortical bones, and then losing bone in trabecular bones, and the potential for high risk of vertebral fracture. Points that we need to ponder: osteoporosis is significantly underdiagnosed in Asian countries. And with the aging population, we should expect to see high rate of osteoporotic fracture. Even WHO is recommending having more studies in those countries to see what is happening in terms of risk of fracture. And this is my last slide.
That was great, Hassan. Thank you so much. Lots of information. I want to take this chance to thank all of our panelists, as that was a very informative presentation. So much information to think about. We'll now turn to a short question and answer period and try to squeeze in as many questions as we can. So I think we'll start with Dr. Tile. Dr. Tile, first question that we've received is, can calcium supplements increase serum calcium levels?
Yes, thanks for that question. It's important to realize that calcium is actually very tightly regulated in the body. So it's very difficult to get into trouble with high calcium in the blood from high calcium levels, because in fact the kidney will spill out extra calcium. So with high amounts of calcium intake, certainly there can be an increased risk for kidney stones. That's usually with calcium of greater than about 2 grams per day. But if somebody does have high calcium, then I think medically we need to look for what the reason is. Could this be hyperparathyroidism? Or sometimes actually with very high doses of vitamin D and vitamin D toxicity, people can present with high calcium levels or hypercalcemia. So I hope that answers your question. Somebody asked also about megadosing of calcium to support bone healing. And I think based on this, we really don't have evidence for it. The body will use the calcium it needs and spill the rest. And sometimes people can have complications.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lianne. That was great. Our second question I'll pose to Jen. Jen, can you explain briefly the difference between elemental and supplemental calcium?
Sure. So, well, elemental calcium might be the amount of calcium in a supplement. So let's just walk through this. So basically, there's an amount of calcium that's in a food, or an amount of calcium that's in a supplement. But in the case of a supplement, there's also the weight of the supplement itself. So when you pick up a supplement and you look at the front of the label, it might say 1,000 milligrams on the front. When you turn the supplement container to the side, it'll say contains calcium citrate or calcium carbonate, 350 milligrams or 500 milligrams. So it's important that you look to the side of your supplement and check that to make sure that you're getting an accurate portrayal or image of how much calcium you're trying to obtain. And it's worth noting, I know in the chat function, I've been trying to answer quickly to people typing back, that when we're talking about calcium needs, your objective is to supplement, if you need to, up to what your requirement is. So if you're looking to get 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day, then the target would be, hey, if I'm eating about 900 milligrams of calcium, then I should look for a supplement that would provide me with about 300 milligrams of elemental calcium. That's roughly what we try to accomplish versus sort of mega dosing on supplements. And while I've got you, I got a number of questions about almond milks. So real quick, plant-based milks do often they're often fortified with calcium, but you want to check your labels. You also want to shake those before you drink them, because the calcium will often settle at the bottom. And people were also asking about oxalate content of almond milks, and the oxalate content of a homemade almond milk tends to be moderate, but it's quite low in the store-bought. So it's down in the order of, say, 10 milligrams or so, low enough that you would be able to absorb most of the calcium. It would be relatively bioavailable.
Wow, that's great. Thank you, Jen. Our last question, because of our time restrictions here, we'll go to Hassan. Hassan, can you update us on the evidence around calcium supplementation and CVD risk?
Well, thank you. I see that in chat box there are questions on that as well. You saw in one of my slides that comparing 2004, 2015, milk intake and also supplement intake, overall calcium intake has gone down. And then why? Because this kind of wave of awareness about calcium and risk of cardiovascular studies started from 2009, when Vincent and his colleagues from New Zealand, they published that, well, there is a risk. Yeah, they had a randomized trial originally designed for a different perspective, and they came up to the conclusion that, oh, okay, so we see more kind of cardiovascular events in those who are taking calcium supplement. But and then after that snowballing started, others went to their data, okay, let's check to see if we can find anything. So basically what I can tell you, looking at all those data, I have worked on it significantly and published a few reviews and so on. And looking at them, you see that most of those studies are primarily were not designed to look into calcium supplementation and risk of cardiovascular disease. So in terms of power of the study, those detailed kind of advanced statistics, they had huge problems in some of them, especially the New Zealand study. I believe for New Zealand study, there were around 17 papers written just criticizing how they were wrong in their analysis. And then after that, there were others that came in, and then they looked at two different line of evidence, many reviews, many systematic reviews, and then position papers coming from Osteoporosis Canada, in United States, other organizations, to go through the evidence and reassure what is happening. The mechanism that they were claiming, hypothetical mechanism, is that, yes, whatever you take from diet is going to be absorbed with no complication, but calcium, as soon as you have calcium from supplement, increases serum calcium, and then it causes calcification. And you heard before, right, at the first question, that calcium is really very tightly regulated, and still that hypothetical theory is not approved. And there are animal studies that they tried to look into that, they couldn't find any evidence. Also, there have been papers looking into the potential for causal inference between the findings of different studies. They couldn't find any. So the most recent meta-analysis systematic review that was done was in 2019. The conclusion that they made was that if you are taking your calcium from food, you shouldn't be worried. But calcium from supplement may cause a problem related to cardiovascular risk. But if you go to the papers that randomized trials that they enter to that review, you see that the amount of supplemental calcium that they have provided was between 1,000 milligram per day to 1,400 milligram per day, at the top of their habitual calcium intake. So then you already know that, say, we are not recommending more than 2,000 milligram calcium, and then the Osteoporosis Canada, DRI, they are recommending around 1,200 milligram calcium. So it's much higher than what we should be getting. So definitely, whatever you get higher, it might have harm effects. So long story short, it would be good, especially for women in postmenopausal women, or those who have osteoporosis. It would be great if you monitor your calcium intake. We have an Osteoporosis Canada calcium calculator. You can use it. And then if I recommend something for myself and my family, I would say that take calcium mainly from diet. And if you cannot make it with the type of diet that you have, do diet modification to get it from diet. And if you can, then go to supplement. But definitely, we don't need high amount of supplement.
Great. Thank you so much, Hassan. I'd like to say thank you to our three experts, Dr. Lianne, Jennifer Sygo, and Dr. Hassan Vatanparast, for an informative presentation on dispelling myths about calcium and bone health, and for answering so many questions. We also want to thank you for joining us today. Visit Osteoporosis Canada and our website for more information and to stay connected. Watch for the release of our new clinical practice guidelines in 2021, which will include some nutrition recommendations. And this webinar has been recorded and will be available on the OC replay page in 48 hours. It will be the entire presentation and not individual slides. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for coming and wish you all a pleasant day. Thank you.